I was jokingly going to say that for the last 5 years, we've spent about, well, millions of dollars trying to figure out what the future looks like, because that's one of the roles that my team has. We're responsible for not innovating Dell's products and services, but instead helping Dell itself be a more innovative company. So we work with the engineering teams to help them work on their innovation. We've started working with our customers and helping them develop their ability to be more innovative. So we are not innovators, we are innovation innovators, which is slightly different take on it. One of the responsibilities we have is to construct future scenarios. One of the things, and what Sarah asked me to talk about, was a little bit about what the future is going to look like and how you need to prepare for it. My team is sometimes accused of practicing black magic, basically because it is very, very difficult to predict the future. So I'm going to take a few minutes and walk you through our process so that you have a feel for the statements that I make a little bit later, where they came from and how they were actually developed. And what Niels Bohr said is absolutely true. Trying to predict the future is extremely difficult. However, it can be done. And what we believe, it was supposed to pop up, no, we're okay. But what we believe is that if you want to be successful, you have to at least anticipate the future. So what we do is we construct what are called future scenarios. Things that different kinds of combinations of forces and trends of what we expect the world is going to look like, and then we take it back and work with our engineering groups to figure out how we can best play in that. The starting point of this is what we call our foresight activity. And what we do in the foresight activity is basically we're focusing on all the non-technical things that are happening out in the marketplaces, changes in demographics, changes in social mores, changes in values and value propositions that people are looking at, changes in regulation. And we basically bring all of those together into what we call our foresight model. And then we marry the foresight model against something we call the insight model. What the insight model is doing is looking at what we do know and projecting it into the future. How many people have ever heard of Moore's Law? Moore's Law is an example of a set of insight. We know that we're going to get this continuous type of projection going forward. So our foresight, the insight activity is really what we refer to is knowing what we know. So insight is collecting what we know and putting it into a form we can deal with it. Foresight is more of trying to know what we don't know. So if you put those two together, you're now in a position to start talking about generation of the scenarios. And what we do when we generate our scenarios is we do two things. One, we bring the insight and the foresight together and actually create scenarios and future forecasts about the world is going to be looking like. We then work with our strategy teams, and the strategy teams take our scenarios and they then do traditional strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, look at the company and say, okay, here are the scenarios we're interested in participating in. What additional capabilities do we need? What additional things do we need to learn? And what comes out of that is what we call our plans. First, we have plans of investigation, which is where we really want to play in this scenario, but we don't know enough about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go do some trials. We're going to do some proof of concepts. We're going to go hook up with some of the incubators out there. We're going to do things with our customers generally. And these, by the way, are designed to fail, which is an interesting change for a large company. We actually go into experiments and proof of concepts knowing that the likelihood of them succeeding is very, very small because they're meant to be learning experiences. Then we do what we put together what we call plans of intent. And what a plan of intent is, it says we definitely know that we want to play in that scenario, but we don't have all the capabilities we need to do that. So we're now going to acquire those capabilities, either organically or inorganically. I don't know, how many of you have paid attention to Dell over the last 2 years? Oh, that's interesting. Generally, non-tech audiences don't pay that much attention to Dell. Well, one of the things you will notice about Dell, above and beyond the fact we've gone private, is the fact that we've been a very aggressive acquirer of other companies. And it's a function of these plans of intent where we've looked at ourselves and said, here's a future scenario we want to play in. We don't have the capabilities we need to be successful there. We're going to go out and acquire them. Now, we're also developing them organically inside the enterprise, but for the lion's share of it, it's done inorganically. And then plans of record are actually what are the modifications we're going to make on our existing product lines to make them work. The thing that's new, just within the last couple of years, is we are now actually doing that with some of our customers. So we will sit down with our customers, we'll bring in our scenarios, we will work with them, and then generally what we're doing is we're helping them with a specific problem they're trying to accomplish. So we introduce some of our innovative tools to do that. There we go. Give you a flavor of some of the things that we work on. These are some of the weak signals and what we call macro trends that we're currently focusing on. When we're doing our foresight activities, what we have found more valuable than anything else is what we call weak signals. Weak signals, if you're reading about it in the paper or a Gartner report or a Forrester or IDC or McKinsey has put a paper on, it's too late. It's already out there. It is an in-place trend. So what we do is we do things like we monitor the internet, the social media. We look to see what are the new things people are talking about, what are thought leaders starting to talk about. What's turned out to be a better predictor of the future for us is when thought leaders quit talking about something. It's kind of interesting. So these are this is a small sample. We have a little over 200 macro trends and weak signals that we are tracking. One of the ones I'm going to focus on with you as we go through the presentation is the concept of intelligent everything. You may have heard the terms Internet of Things or Industrial Internet. It's actually a little bit more sophisticated than that. Internet of Things and Industrial Internet are talking about the technical aspects of it. When we talk about intelligent everything, we're talking about a change in the way we interact with our products and services, and as a consequence, a change in the way we interact with our companies. Now, after we've done all of that stuff, the real black magic comes into play, because you can predict the future, and I jokingly say everything I say I absolutely guarantee you will take place, just don't hold me to a time frame. One of the things that makes it really valuable is if you can actually say this is when it's going to happen. How many people are familiar with S-curves? Pretty much everybody has seen an S-curve, and the diffusion of innovation, the bell-shaped curve, early adopters, late adopters, majority, whatever. Well, what we do is we actually have a series of, I'll call them algorithms, but it gives them much more credit than they actually deserve, which allow us to take those weak signals that we get from the foresight activities, take the technology insights that we get from the insight activities, and begin to map out when it is likely that particular type of innovation will come into play. Now, a lot of people think innovation is this creative, wonderful. It's actually, that's only half of the problem. The other half of the problem is a structured engineering part of innovation. In fact, what our research tells us is most innovation requires 3 personality types to be successful. Sometimes, once in a great while, you will find all 3 personality types in one person. Generally not. The first personality type is the idea generator. The person who can come out with the idea, this creative new way of thinking about things. The second personality we refer to as the idea manifester, someone who can take that wonderful idea and actually turn it into something. How many people remember Steve Jobs? Idea generator. Who was the idea manifester? Wozniak, absolutely true. And by the way, nobody ever remembers Wozniak, right? It's very rare that he's remembered. And then you have to have the idea communicator, someone who can translate what that thing is doing into a value proposition into the marketplace. How many people remember who we've identified Jobs, Wozniak, who was the communicator? Regis McKenna. Ended up growing one of the largest advertising agencies ever, basically because of the work that he did at Apple. So, what we have to do is we actually have to map what we are learning against some kind of timing. And what we have found out is there's a couple of things. One is when people talk about innovation, they're generally thinking in terms of disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation is where I've totally changed the marketplace. I've totally changed the businesses. Disruptive innovation doesn't happen that often, and most of the time it happens by accident. In fact, most innovation is what we refer to as incremental and sustaining innovation. It's basically continuing on doing what you're doing it, but doing it better, faster, and cheaper. You can also have what we call breakthrough innovation. Breakthrough innovation is basically talking about the fact that I can take my existing technologies, I can take my existing business processes, and I can now generate a new value proposition using what I already have. That's a form of breakthrough innovation. Another form of breakthrough innovation is where I take new technologies and new business processes and generate exactly the same value proposition as I've been generating. That's another form of breakthrough innovation. Disruptive innovation generally involves totally new business models, totally new technologies, totally new value propositions into the marketplace. How many people think the Apple iPod was a disruptive innovation? Some of you have been around me before, so you know it's a trick question. If you actually look at it, it's a breakthrough innovation. Because what it is, it's just the next generation of MP3 player. Apple had the foresight to ignore all of the marketing research for MP3 players, which said they needed more buttons so that you could do things like catalog and do all those kinds of things, and went down to one button. It's a breakthrough. The disruptive innovation was what? iTunes was the disruptive innovation. Totally new business model, done a totally different way, using technology in ways that hadn't been used before. So anyway, part of what we do is we actually map these against S-curves, and historically, and we've only been doing this for 5 years, but we're betting about 90% both on what we were predicting and what our timing is. So time to go create a consulting firm, right? Okay. Next. There we go. Then the last part of this equation is you actually have to take what you know and map it against some type of value proposition for business. By the way, all of these slides you can get from Sarah. They'll be available to you. And again, I apologize, I won't be here through the entire day because of this cold, among other things. And Sarah also has my business card, so you'll be able to get a hold of me if you need to get a hold of. But what we end up doing is now we have to map all of this stuff together into something that begins looking like product plans and service offerings, and you actually have to manifest those in terms of a value proposition for the customer. And we call this the context architecture, and this is actually the way that we go about doing that. All right. Oh, is that washed out to you? Oh, okay, maybe it's because I'm too close. Okay, now to get to the meat of the presentation with 10 minutes left. What's the future going to look like? I'm going to sum up everything that we've learned basically in this slide. And what we've learned is there's a major upheaval about to happen in the economy, and impacting mostly large companies rather than small companies. And this shift is the total nature in which profit is generated. What has come out of the research is that most companies make their profit. The initial profit is made when they introduce a new product and service. From that period forward, most of their profit is made from their ability to reduce the transaction costs associated with that product or service. A transaction cost are all the costs that you incur that have nothing to do with creating the value of that product and service. Transaction costs are things like legal, HR, marketing, sales. None of those have anything to do with the actual value creation process. So they're referred to as transactions costs. They're costs you incur in order to have the transaction, the exchange of value. And most companies have achieved their profits as they grow through their ability to gain scale and then drive productivity and efficiency against that scale. And if you actually go in and analyze most companies, that's where their profits are coming from. Their profit margins are coming from. Interesting thing is happening in the marketplace. Most companies, the reason they grow large and need to achieve scale and they have all of these transaction costs is they are trying to overcome 4 economic frictions: time, space, access to capital, and information. You look at the way companies are organized. They're designed to basically overcome time, space, not so much access to capital, and an information flow, all right? Well, what's happened is those frictions are gradually going away. You see over here on your left is a typical value creation stream, right? If I wanted to create a product, the starting point of the product is somebody else had to go out and find where the iron ore is. Then they had to put all of the capital into it to create a mine, to mine the iron ore. And then somebody had to put all the capital into it to create a railroad to get the iron ore to a refinery. Somebody had to put all the capital into it to get into the refinery, to get the refinery to produce the steel. And the steel has to be on another railroad to get over to a manufacturing plant. Manufacturing plant required a whole bunch of capital to be able to actually then turn that into a product, and they also had to have a shipping capability to get the product to a retailer. Retailer had to get, you see the process. And the key elements in all of that is, as I've said, access to capital, time, space, geography, moving stuff around, and then information, being able to communicate that flow back and forth to people. What's happened with the internet? Well, let me tell you a story. Two guys are out fishing. So they've gotten in their rowboat and they've rowed out and they're in the middle of the lake and they're casting and they're reeling and they're casting and they're reeling. And they go, you know, if we just make this one little change to this reel, we can catch a whole lot more fish. Or we can drink more beer and catch the same amount of fish, whichever their, you know, what their values are. So they row back in and they get on their PC and they bring up a free software as a service CAD program. And then from that, they also get, how many people are familiar with the Makers Movement? Good group. If you're not, you need to get familiar with the Makers Group. How many people are familiar with open source? Everybody knows open source. Well, an interesting thing has happened. The Makers Movement is doing exactly the same thing the open source movement is doing. If you go out there, you can find CAD designs for almost every product you can think of, freely available, that you can pull in and use for your own purposes. So the guys go out and they find a CAD version of the reel. They make their little modification. They ship the CAD file over to Kinko's FedEx, which is in the process of putting 3D printers in all of their locations. And they print off a copy of it and they assemble it and they show it to their friends. Their friend makes some ideas for improvements. They go in and make the modifications to it and they start a Kickstarter campaign. In a couple of months, they've raised, let's say, $1 million. They take the $1 million and their CAD file and they ship it to an offshore job shop manufacturer. They sign up UPS to be their logistics and distribution arm. They open up an Amazon storefront, and 90 days later, they go fishing in the middle of the Gulf in their 60-foot yacht. The whole concept of friction is gone. It used to be if you were a small company and you wanted a loan to do something, you walked into the banker and said, hey, I've got this great, wonderful idea. I need $1 million to make it real. They would say, well, the coffee's over there, donuts are there, and the door's around the corner. Somebody like Dell would come in, probably with the same exact idea, only it would take us $10 million to do it, right? Would go to the banker and say, look, I need $10 million, I got this great idea. They said, no problem, go upstairs, the champagne and the caviar is sitting there, and when you finish, we'll have the contracts drawn up and everything's wonderful. That was the difference, right? What can a small company do today? Open up a Kickstarter campaign. So the friction of capital is all but gone. In fact, there's recently, I don't remember what the 3D goggle, the virtual reality goggles was, but 148 million was raised in Kickstarter, I think. Yeah, thank you. Let's talk about geography. How many people have seen a 3D printer? Do you know that a 3D printer can print just about anything now? In fact, if you go on and Google 3D printer jet engine, you can see a jet engine that was totally printed out using a 3D printer working by GE. If I can print out a working jet engine with a 3D printer, there's not a whole lot I can't, right? And the new materials. How many people have heard of graphene? You should pay attention to graphene. Tremendous, I mean, there's things to be worked out, pay attention to. Well, think about this over here on the left, and now let's compare it over to the right, where the three guys, basically, they don't need the job shop manufacturer anymore, do they? They can sit there, they can pull the information. It used to be information differential, big thing, right? If I was going to design a jet engine, I needed to know a whole lot of stuff. There are literally jet engine CAD designs out on the internet now. So the information differentials. How many of you bought a car recently? Did you immediately go into the dealer and talk to the dealer and start negotiating? No, you went on the internet and you found out what everybody in the world is paying for exactly the car you want. My example about profit margins. Remember back in the old days, I won't tell you how old I am, When you wanted a car, you went into the dealer, and the dealer knew this, and you knew that, and you negotiated, and then his profit margin was that difference. When you go into the dealer, what do you know? All of a sudden, his profit margins are going away. So when you start thinking about it, what it means is we have to be thinking about a different model for profit. And the different model for profit is the monopoly profit model. How many people know what monopoly profits are? One person, because you've heard me talk about it before. There are two forms of monopoly profits. The first form of monopoly profit is you've got really good friends in government. Okay. The second form of monopoly profit is that short period of time when you have a value proposition in the marketplace that nobody else has and can command whatever price you want for it. And where does that short period of time of having a value proposition that nobody else has come from? Innovation. So successful companies in the future are not the large companies achieving scale and driving down transaction costs through productivity and efficiency. The large companies of the future will be those companies that can be serially innovative, continuously and and constantly innovating. And it's actually manifesting itself, I'll speed up a little bit, in the way CEOs are thinking about their companies. CEOs used to think of their companies, and if you've worked in a large company, most of the time you spend is how can we drive down cost, right? Or how can we expand and get more customers for exactly what we already have? That's changing. Now you have CEOs who are starting to think of their companies in terms of, I've got to become this serial innovator. Well, how do I become a serial innovator? I become a serial innovator by quickly figuring out what the market needs and getting there with a value proposition before anybody else. And the likelihood of me having all of the resources I need to create that value proposition is almost zero. So now I have to rethink my organization instead of scale efficiency into collaboration, coordination, choreographic efficacy. How can I bring together all of these little companies that are the best in the world at what they do and assemble them into a value proposition into the marketplace as quickly as possible? So that's a major shift in the way we're thinking about companies. I put this slide up here in particular. If you remember on the other slide, when it talks about old companies, it talks about systems of record. That's basically the old transaction ERP systems, all of those kinds of things, and that's where most companies are still investing their IT. Now what are companies starting to invest in? Social, mobile, analytics, cloud. What that really is talking about is this idea that I've got to be able to coordinate all of these small companies, all the individuals. One of the interesting things that comes out of our research is within 5 years, 80% of the people who work for a company will not work for the company. They'll be independent contractors that are brought in on a time basis when they're needed, or they will work for a small company that is doing exactly the same thing. That then creates these systems of engagement, which is on the other slide, and now we have what are beginning to form up as systems of automation. How many people have heard of the Internet of Things and the industrial internet? There's also the web of things. There's all kinds of things. You've got a little slide there that shows how they all put together. The key thing to understand there is they change the nature of value. How many people have got a Star Trek communicator on your hip? Every one of you have got a Star Trek communicator. It's called a smartphone. Now there's a difference, right? Captain Kirk's Star Trek communicator could do one thing, right? You know, Scotty, beam me up. Scotty, where are the Klingons? Scotty, has the red shirt dyed yet? That was the limits of it. What can yours do? It can tell you where you are. It can tell you who you're with. It can tell you what you're supposed to be doing next. It can tell you there's a Chinese restaurant just around the corner that has that specialty food that you like. And by the way, they have open. You don't have the Star Trek communicator. You have the entire sensor array of the Starship Enterprise on your hip. By the way, there's something in foresight called Amara's Law, which says that we historically overestimate technology in the short run and underestimate it in the long run, and that's a classic example of that. So anyway, what the Internet of Things, the industrial internet means is now at this point in time, we have people shifting from a value proposition, I may need something someday, to I want it right now, and it's got to be perfect for right now. So The fact that my cell phone knows where I'm at, who I'm with, what my plans are for the day, my food preferences, my timing preferences, any allergies that I have, what my current bank account is, where my friends are, all of a sudden, you have to know that too. Because the opportunity to create value for that customer is going to be in the moment. Because right that second, when he says, I'm hungry, you need to be able to immediately respond to it. Or if he says, I got to pick something up on the way home. Oh, Siri, I've taken care of it. The roses will be there. It's your wife's birthday. Don't worry about it. It's all taken care of. So it's this idea that value is no longer a function of your value proposition that you've known it in the past. It is a function of context. It is the value proposition is a function of where the person is consuming the value, who he's consuming the value with, where he's consuming it, and in what time frame that he's consuming it with. That then leads over to the changing nature of analytics. There are really 4 forms of analytics. There is exploratory analytics. I'm just looking at this to see what I can possibly discover out of it. There is descriptive analytics, which is historically when the Census Bureau comes out and they says there's so many of us that are of these different races and they have different income brackets. Those are descriptive analytics. There are predictive analytics that say that based upon what we see, this is going to happen. And then there is prescriptive analytics that say if this happens, this is what we should do about it. What's really happening now is you're seeing most companies, when they do their analytics, they're basically doing the descriptive analytics, and some are beginning to do predictive analytics. But if you are going to create a value proposition in the moment for an individual based upon all of this data, you're going to have to shift over to prescriptive analytics. You're going to have to turn it over to the AIs. How many people saw Minority Report? We're almost there. We're almost there. Now, there's an interesting side effect to this. What is it that managers and executives do? Gather all the information, predict what's going to happen, and then when it happens, takes action. What we are seeing is that the growth of analytics in conjunction with all of the data, because what you're getting is finer and finer grain data and more data. For example, an offshore oil rig generates 3 terabytes of data a minute. If BP had been analyzing all of the data the rig had been doing, they could have predicted and prevented what happened. So by the way, this is not just a market value proposition. Lawyers are going to get involved and say, you got to start doing this stuff. So the end state is what we are now entering in is, people remember the Luddites? Luddites were the guys who came in and said, hey, you can't let the machine do the weaving. People have to do it, and they broke up the machines. And then we've had basically the union's reaction, the robots, right? We are now seeing the dawn of the executive robot. Management position and executive positions are going away because what most of them do is what can be now done with predictive and prescriptive analytics. So they have to move on and become creative. They have to become innovative. They can't just sit in their rooms and look at spreadsheets anymore. Now, what that's done is that's introduced 2 new paradigms in the way we have to think about our businesses. And again, you'll get the slides, and the references are on the slides. The first is the way we organize have to be different. Okay, remember I said that in 5 years, 80% of the people who work for a company won't work for a company? Well, there's an interesting problem with that. There's this term called institutional memory. Now, companies tried to create knowledge management systems, and we've been talking about this for years, right? We started talking about knowledge management systems in the 80s, because in the 80s we were predicting that the baby boomers, like me, at some point in time were going to retire, forget, or die. And by the way, we are currently retiring, forgetting, and dying, but that's another story. But nobody ever built the knowledge management systems to preserve what we knew about the market, the industry, the machines that we were working on. I have one customer that is heavily engineering driven. I will tell you, it's a railroad. But all of their records and all of their institutional memory are in are in paper in this warehouse, huge filing cabinets with traditional library card. By the way, just as an aside, I was talking to a bunch of new MBAs and I used the card catalog analogy. They didn't know what a card catalog was. Well, as you can imagine, the problem that this railroad has, because guess what all of their engineers are? They're new, they're young. They don't know what a card catalog are. You want them to go look at paper, and not just look at paper, look at this piece of paper, so they'll tell me to go look at this piece of paper. Not happening, right? Well, we have to rethink the way that we organize our companies in the sense that the company itself has to become the institutional memory. Now, this can be done through knowledge management systems, but more than likely it's going to be done through what are called values and moral structures. And I won't go into the details of that, but it's a different way of thinking about it. The other thing is the role of the manager goes away. If you think about what we've been doing, I mean, we run our companies exactly the same way the Roman legions were run, right? You know, the troops at the end, and reported to a few, to one guy, right? Won't work going into the future. So into the future, we have to have organizations that are dynamic, that the function and structure of the organization emerges based upon what the organization is trying to accomplish at that point in time. Think about GE. GE already knows that they are on the cusp of being able to build a jet engine that will last forever, because they're embedding it with all of the sensors, and the sensors can predict failure before the failure takes, combination with the analytics can predict the failure before the failure takes place. So that when the plane lands at a particular airport, they will have already printed out the necessary part and have the necessary person there to repair it, to make the swap out. So that for all intents and purposes to the airline, that jet engine lasts forever. It never breaks down, and they never have to replace it. If you're a manufacturer, what's your future look like? You have to become a services company. And in fact, GE is starting to offer thrust as a service. Maintenance contracts. Actually, what we're seeing is away from traditional maintenance contracts to this idea of, we'll guarantee 100% uptime. You're going to pay us like thrust as a service. One railroad has gone to miles as a service. So you're seeing this shift over to a service. Well, that type of organization doesn't fit into that structural hierarchy too terribly well. So what you have over here is a totally different model for organizations. And we also have to change the way we make decisions. Up here on the left, you see something that's called the Keynote network. Keynote happens to be a Welsh word. It's derived out of the complex adaptive systems space. And we're starting to see companies practice it. In fact, there is an article by a gentleman by the name of Snowden in the Harvard Business Review, I think November of 2011, I think, where he talks about applying this model to decision making. And what it is the complex adaptive system guys have come back and said there are really 4 types of systems in the world. There are simple systems that basically function the same, it's like a calculator, the arithmetic, they always work. There are complicated systems, there are complex systems, and there are chaotic systems. What we have learned from our research is the fact that most companies operate as simple systems. In a simple system, you know what you know. And when something happens, you look at it, you sense it, and then you categorize it. Oh, this problem is an X problem. And I go look up, in my McKinsey book of best practices, whenever I encounter this X problem, I have to apply this best practice. That is how most companies are run today. That only works in simple systems. What's happening right now is we're in the process of transitioning to complex systems, and we're now in what are called complicated. Complicated systems are where you know what you don't know. Well, this new generation, they don't work like the rest of us. This 9 to 5 thing coming into the office, we don't understand. So you know what you don't know, and you can call in consultants like McKinsey that can help you figure it out. And then you don't have a wealth of best practices, because not everybody in the world is encountering the same thing. You have good enough practices. But where it gets really interesting is the world we're going to, which is complex world. If you think about all of those sensors and all of this, what's the likelihood that you're going to have? If I were to go out and pick up all of your phones, and let's just for sake of argument say all of you have iPhones, what is the probability each one of those phones is identical? That you have the same apps on it, that you have the same people in your contacts, that you have the same linkages for your URLs in your bookmarks? 0. Well, think about all the information that's coming in from the Internet of Things, all the information that will be collected. The fact is, all of a sudden, you've gone from this concept of mass marketing to, I forget what the marketing people call it, but the cohorts, they lump people in the cohorts. We have the millennials, and we have the college educated, to each individual person being a market. If that's not a definition of complexity, I don't know what it is. And the problem with complexity is you don't know what you don't know. And to be successful in a complex world, what you have to do is you have to probe, sense, and then respond based upon what you sensed. Well, what is the probing? That's innovation. One of the things that comes out of all of our research is most innovation is a product of failure. Fail fast, fail furiously, learn, try it again. Well, what that really is that's probing in a complex systems environment, is what you're really doing. That totally changes the way that we do management, because if you think about what I said before about predictive and prescriptive analytics can do all of the work in a simple system and in a complicated system. The only value we as humans give to the process is when things get complex, which fortunately is what's happening. Let me end by saying that what we see happening is companies are beginning to disaggregate themselves, that they're breaking themselves up into smaller and smaller parts. And the reason they're doing this is CEOs are starting to ask a new set of questions. The first question, whenever they're looking at what they are doing, is, does this create value for my customers? If it doesn't create value for my customers, why am I doing it? I could find somebody who could create value for me by doing it for me. So that's the first question they ask. The second question that they're starting to ask is, am I the best in the world at doing this, or could I be? And if I'm not, well, I should go get the best in the world to go do it for me, because my ability to create value is dependent upon being the best in the world or one of the best in it. Third question they ask is, do I have to do this for legal or regulatory reasons? You can't get away from it. Some things you're just going to have to do because the government says you have to do. Although what's coming out of some of the more interesting studies is most companies significantly overestimate how much they really have to do. Most of the time, they just have to certify that it was done. They don't actually have to do it, which is. Sarbanes-Oxley is a case in point. I don't know if any of you've worked recently with large companies after Sarbanes-Oxley, but all of a sudden, if you're a manager, you had 20 times more work to do. Reality is you really didn't have to do that. You just have to certify that you were doing it. It's kind of funny to watch. So they have those three questions that they're asking themselves. Then they ask themselves, and if you think about it, the end result of that is it makes sense for me to bring together lots of little bitty people who are experts at doing one thing really, really well and assemble them together to create the value propositions for the market. So you're going to see this rise of what we call ecosystems. You'll hear the word ecosystem coming out of the consultants, coming out of the academics, and that's where they're headed for. To me, what this means is this is going to be the rise of small business, because the people who operate, and think about it, quick question, how many people have ever taken, how many people know what dinosaurs are, right? Okay. You have any idea what was the single most efficient organism ever to live on Earth? It was one of the dinosaurs. I forget, I think they're called Diplodocus or something like that now, but the brontosaurs, right? The really huge things. They were the single most efficient translating mass into energy, and allowed them to get really huge, like large companies, right? And really huge, really efficient organisms are really efficient because they are highly adapted to a specific ecosystem. What happened when the asteroid got rid of that ecosystem? Poof. What survived? The small, tiny, high variability, adaptable, agile, flexible organizations, and basically that was we, the mammals, we came out through the head. Same thing's happening in business. The asteroid is the Internet of Things and the industrial internet. Totally changes the nature of business, and the fact that now you have exactly the same amount of information available to you as a small business that a large company has. You have exactly the same availability to capital that most large companies. It's not exactly the same, but good enough. And the issue of space and time is all but gone. So when you put all of those things together, what we're seeing is a real shift into the growth of startups. And by the way, the expectation of the lifetime of a company is going to shrink, because inevitably as a startup, if you're successful, you start getting big. When you start getting big, you start adding all of these things to control your transaction costs, and eventually you're large, and another smart startup comes up and takes you away. So anyway, with that, I went over my time. I apologize. Sarah has my presentation and my cards, and it usually takes me a day or two to get back to you if you email me, but I'll be glad to do that. Thank you, guys.